Chapter 27 Empire and Expansion, from the years 1890 to 1909. Quote, "We assert that no nation can long endure half republic and half empire, and we warn the American people that imperialism abroad will lead quickly and inevitably to despotism at home." In the Democratic National Platform, 1900. In the years immediately following the Civil War, Americans remained astonishingly indifferent to the outside world. Enmeshed in struggles over Reconstruction and absorbed in efforts to heal the wounds of Civil War, build an industrial economy, make their cities habitable, and settle the sprawling West, most citizens took little interest in international affairs. But the sunset decades of the 19th century witnessed a momentous shift in U.S. foreign policy. American policy reflected the far-reaching changes that were reshaping agriculture, industry, and the social structure. American statesmen also responded to the intensifying scramble of several other nations for international advantage in the dawning age of empire. By the beginning of the 20th century, America had acquired its own empire, an astonishing departure from its venerable anti-colonial traditions. The world had now had to reckon with a new great power, potentially powerful, but with diplomatic ambitions and principles that remained to be defined. America turns outward. Many developments fed the nation's ambition for overseas expansion. Both farmers and factory owners began to look for markets beyond American shores as agricultural and industrial production boomed. Many Americans believed that the United States had to expand or explode. Their country was bursting with a new sense of power generated by the robust growth in population, wealth, and productive capacity. And it was trembling from the hammer blows of labor violence and agrarian unrest. Overseas markets might provide a safety valve to relieve those pressures. Other forces also whetted the popular appetite for overseas involvement. The lurid Yellow Press of Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst described foreign exploits as manly adventures, the kind of dashing derring-do that was the stuff of young boys' dreams. Pious missionaries, inspired by books like the Reverend Josiah Strong's Our Country, Its Possible Future, and Its Present Crisis, looked overseas for new souls to harvest. Strong trumpeted the superiority of Anglo-Saxon civilization and summoned Americans to spread their religion and their values to the backwards peoples. He cast a seed on fertile ground. At the same time, aggressive Americans like Theodore Roosevelt and Congressman, later Senator, Henry Cabot Lodge were interpreting Darwinism to mean the earth belonged to the strong and the fit. That is, to Uncle Sam. This view was strengthened as latecomers to the colonial scramble scooped up leavings from the banquet table of earlier dinners. Africa, previously unexplored and mysterious, was partitioned by the Europeans in the 1880s in a pell-mell rush of colonial conquest. In the 1890s, Japan, Germany, and Russia all extorted concessions from the anemic Chinese Empire. If America was to survive in the competition of modern nation-states, perhaps it, too, would have to become an imperial power. The development of a new steel navy also focused attention overseas. Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan's book of 1890, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783, argued that control of the sea was key to world dominance. Mahan helped stimulate the naval race among the great powers that gained momentum around the turn of the century. Red-blooded Americans joined in the demand for a mightier navy and for an American-built Isthmian canal between the Atlantic and the Pacific. America's new international interest manifested itself in several ways. Two-time Secretary of State James G. Blaine pushed his Big Sister policy, aimed at rallying the Latin American nations behind Uncle Sam's leadership and opening Latin American markets to Yankee traders. Blaine's effort bore some fruit in 1889 when he presided over the first Pan-American Conference held in Washington, D.C., the modest beginnings of an increasingly important series of inter-American assemblages. A number of diplomatic crises or near wars also marked the path of American diplomacy in the late 1880s and early 1890s. The American and German navies nearly came to blow in 1889 over the faraway Samoan Islands in the South Pacific, which were formally divided between the two nations in 1899. German Samoa eventually became an American republic. American Samoa remains an American possession. The lynching of 11 Italians in New Orleans in 1891 brought American Italy to the brink of war, until the United States agreed to pay compensation. In the ugliest affair, American demands on Chile after the death of 2 American sailors in the port of Valparaiso in 1892 made hostilities between the two countries seem inevitable. The threat of attack by Chile's modern navy spread alarm on the Pacific coast, until the Chileans finally agreed to pay an indemnity. A simmering argument between the United States and Canada over seal hunting near the Pribilof Islands off the coast of Alaska was resolved by arbitration in 1893. The willingness of Americans to risk war over such distant and minor disputes demonstrated the aggressive new national mood. America's new belligerence, combined with old-time anti-British feeling, generated a serious crisis between the United States and Britain in 1895 to 1896. The jungle boundary between British Guiana and Venezuela had long been in dispute, but the discovery of gold in the contested area brought the conflict between Britain and Venezuela to a head. President Cleveland and his pugnacious Secretary of State, Richard Olney, waded into the affair with a combative note to Britain invoking the Monroe Doctrine. Not content to stop there, Olney haughtily informed the world's #1 naval power that the United States was now calling the tune in the Western Hemisphere. Unimpressed British officials shrugged off Olney's salvo as just another twist of the lion's tail and replied that the affair was none of Uncle Sam's business. President Cleveland, mad clear through, as he put it, sent a bristling special message to Congress. He urged an appropriation for a commission of experts who would run the line where it ought to go. If the British would not accept this rightful boundary, he implied, the United States would fight for it. The entire country, irrespective of political party, was swept off its feet in an outburst of hysteria. War seemed inevitable. Fortunately, sober second thoughts prevailed on both sides of the Atlantic. A rising challenge from Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany, as well as a looming war with the Dutch-descended Boers in South Africa, left Britain in no mood for war with America. London backed off and consented to an arbitration. The chastened British, their eyes fully open to the European peril, were now determined to cultivate Yankee friendship. The British inaugurated an era of patting the eagle's head, which replaced a century or so of America's twisting the lion's tail. Sometimes called the Great Rapprochement or Reconciliation between the United States and Britain, the new Anglo-American cordiality became a cornerstone of both nations' foreign policies as the 20th century opened. Spurning the Hawaiian pair. Enchanted Hawaii had early attracted the attention of Americans. In the morning years of the 19th century, the breeze-brushed islands were a way station and provisioning point for Yankee shippers, sailors, and whalers. In 1820, the first New England missionaries arrived, preaching the twin blessings of Protestant Christianity and protective calico. They came to do good, and did well, as Hawaii became an increasingly important center for sugar production. Americans gradually came to regard the Hawaiian Islands as a virtual extension of their own coastline. The State Department, beginning in the 1840s, sternly warned other powers to keep their grasping hands off. America's grip was further tightened in 1887 by a treaty with the native government guaranteeing priceless naval base rights at the spacious Pearl Harbor. But trouble was brewing in the insular paradise. Old World pathogens had synced the indigenous Hawaiian population down to 1/6 of its size at the time of first contact with Europeans, leading the American sugar lords to import large number of Asian laborers to work the cane fields and sugar mills. By century's end, Chinese and Japanese immigrants outnumbered both whites and native Hawaiians. Amid mounting worries that Tokyo might be tempted to intervene on behalf of its often abused nationals. Then, sugar markets went sour in 1890, when the McKinley Tariff raised barriers against the Hawaiian product. White American planters thereupon renewed their efforts to secure the annexation of Hawaii to the United States. They were blocked by the strong-willed Queen Liliuokalani, who insisted that native Hawaiians should control the islands. Desperate whites, though only a tiny minority, organized a successful revolt early in 1893, openly assisted by American troops who landed under the unauthorized orders of the expansionist American minister in Honolulu. The Hawaiian pear is now fully ripe, he wrote exultantly to his superiors in Washington, and this is the golden hour for the United States to pluck it. The Treaty of Annexation was rushed to Washington, but before it could be railroaded to the Senate, Republican President Harrison's term expired and Democratic President Cleveland came in. Suspecting that his powerful nation had gravely wronged the deposed Queen Liliuokalani and her people, Old Grover abruptly withdrew the treaty. A subsequent investigation determined that a majority of the Hawaiian natives opposed annexation. Although Queen Liliuokalani could not be reinstated, the sugar-coated move for annexation had to be temporarily abandoned. The Hawaiian pear continued to ripen until the fateful year of 1898, when the United States acquired its overseas empire. Cubans rise and revolt. Cuba's masses, frightfully misgoverned, again rose against their Spanish oppressors in 1895. The roots of their revolt were partially economic. Sugar production, the backbone of the island's prosperity, was crippled when the American tariff of 1894 restored high duties on the toothsome product. The desperate insurgents now sought to drive out their Spanish overlords by adopting a scorched earth policy. The insurrectos torched cane fields and sugar mills and dynamited passenger trains. The destructive tactics also menaced American interests on the island. American sympathies went out to the Cuban underdogs. Sentiment aside, American businesses had an investment stake of about $50 million in Cuba and an annual trade stake of about $100 million, all of it put at risk by a revolutionary upheaval. Moreover, as the calculating Senator Lodge put it, Cuba lay right athwart the line that led to the much-anticipated Panama Canal. Whoever controlled Cuba, said Lodge, controls the Gulf of Mexico. Much was riding on the outcome of the events in troubled Cuba. Fuel was added to the Cuban conflagration in 1896 with the arrival of the Spanish general Butcher Weyler. He undertook to crush the rebellion by herding many civilians into barbed wire reconcentration camps, where they could not give assistance to the armed insurrectos. Lacking proper sanitation, these enclosures turned into deadly pest holes where victims died like dogs. Atrocities in Cuba were red meat for the sensational new yellow journalism of William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Engaged in a titanic duel for circulation, each attempted to outdo the other with their screeching headlines and hair-raising scoops. Where atrocity stories did not exist, they were invented. Hearst sent the gifted artist Frederick Remington to Cuba to draw sketches, allegedly with the pointed admonition, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." Among other outrages, Remington depicted Spanish customs officials brutally disrobing and searching an American woman. Most readers of Hearst's journal, their indignation soaring, had no way of knowing that such tasks were performed by female attendants. Hearst also sensationally publicized a private letter from the Spanish minister in Washington, Dupuy de Lome. The indiscreet epistle, stolen from the mails, describes President McKinley in decidedly unflattering terms. The resulting uproar forced Dupuy de Lome's resignation and further infuriated the American public. Then, in early 1898, Washington sent the battleship Maine to Cuba, ostensibly for a friendly visit, but actually to protect and evacuate Americans if a dangerous flare-up should occur and to demonstrate Washington's concerns for the island's stability. Tragedy struck on February 15, 1898, when the Maine mysteriously blew up in the Havana harbor, with the loss of 260 sailors. 2 investigations of the Iron Coffin ensued, one by U.S. naval officers and the other by Spaniard officials. The Spaniards concluded that the explosion had been internal and presumably accidental. The Americans argued that the blast had been caused by a submarine mine. Not until 1976 did U.S. Navy Admiral H.G. Rickover confirm the original Spanish finding with overwhelming evidence that the initial explosion had resulted from a spontaneous combustion in one of the coal bunkers adjacent to a powder magazine. But Americans in 1898, now mad for war, blindly embraced the less likely explanation. Lashed to fury by the yellow press, they leapt at the inaccurate conclusion that the Spanish government had been guilty of intolerable treachery. The battle cry of the hour became, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Nothing would do but to hurl the dirty Spanish flag from the hemisphere. The national war fever burned ever higher, even though American diplomats had already gained Madrid's agreement to Washington's 2 basic demands, an end to the reconcentration camps and an armistice with the Cuban rebels. The cautious McKinley found himself in a jam. He did not want hostilities, but neither did he want Spain to remain in possession of Cuba, nor, for that matter, did he want a fully independent Cuba, over which the United States could exercise no control. More impetuous souls denounced the circumspect president as Wobbly Willie McKinley. Fight-hungry Theodore Roosevelt reportedly snarls that the white-livered occupant of the White House did not have the backbone of a chocolate eclair. The president, whose shaken nerves required sleeping pills, was even being hanged in effigy. McKinley, recognizing the inevitable, eventually yielded and gave the people what they wanted, but public pressure did not fully explain McKinley's course. He had little faith in Spain's oft-broken promises. He worried about democratic reprisals in the upcoming presidential election of 1900 if he continued to appear indecisive in a time of crisis. He also acknowledged America's commercial and strategic interests in Cuba. On April 11, 1898, McKinley sent his war message to Congress, urging armed intervention to free the oppressed Cubans. The legislators responded uproariously with what was essentially a declaration of war. In a burst of self-righteousness, they likewise adopted the hand-tying Teller Amendment. This proviso proclaimed to the world that when the United States had overthrown the Spanish misrule, it would give the Cubans their freedom, a declaration that would cause imperialistic Europeans to smile skeptically. Dewey's May Day victory at Manila. The American people plunged into war lightheartedly, like schoolchildren off to a picnic. Bands blared incessantly, "There'll be a hot time in Old Town tonight," and "Hail, hail, the gang's all here," leading some foreigners to believe that those were the national anthems. The war got off to a giddy start for American forces. Even before the declaration of war on February 25, 1898, while Navy Secretary John D. Long was away from office, his hot-blooded Assistant Secretary Theodore Roosevelt took matters into his own hands. Roosevelt cabled Commodore George Dewey, commanding the American Asiatic Squad at Hong Kong, to descend upon Spain's Philippines in the event of war. "The very devil seemed to possess him," Long later wrote of Roosevelt's actions. But President McKinley subsequently confirmed Roosevelt's instructions, even though an attack in the distant Far East seemed like a strange way to free nearby Cuba. Dewey carried out his orders magnificently on May 1, 1898. Sailing boldly with his 6 warships at night into the fortified harbor of Manila, he trained his guns the next morning on the moldy 10-ship Spanish fleet. The entire collection of antiquated and overmatched vessels was quickly destroyed, with the loss of nearly 400 Spaniards killed and wounded, and without a single loss of an American life. Taciturn George Dewey became a national hero overnight. An amateur poet blossomed forth with this: "Oh, Dewey was the morning upon the 1st of May, and Dewey was the admiral down in Manila Bay. And Dewey were the Spaniards' eyes, them orbs of black and blue. And do we feel discouraged? I do not think we do." Yet Dewey was in a perilous position. He had destroyed the enemy fleet, but he could not storm the forts of Manila with his sailors. His nerves frayed, and he was forced to wait in the sweltering bay while troop reinforcements were slowly assembled in America. The appearance of German warships in Manila Harbor deepened the tension. Long-awaited American troops, finally arriving in force, captured Manila on August 13, 1898, in collaboration with Filipino insurgents commanded by their well-educated part-Chinese leader, Emilio Aguinaldo. Dewey, to his later regret, had brought this shrewd and magnetic revolutionary from exile in Asia so that he might weaken the Spanish resistance. These thrilling events in the Philippines had meanwhile focused attention on Hawaii, an impression that the Americans needed the archipelago as a coaling and provisioning way station in order to send supplies and reinforcements to Dewey. McKinley also worried that Japan might grab the Hawaiian Islands while America was distracted elsewhere. A joint resolution of annexation was rushed through Congress and approved by McKinley on July 7, 1898. It granted Hawaiian residents U.S. citizenship. Hawaii received full territorial status in 1900. Confused invasion of Cuba. Shortly after the outbreak of war, the Spanish government ordered a fleet of decrepit warships to Cuba. Panic seized the eastern seaboard of the United States. American vacationers abandoned their seashore cottages, while nervous investors moved their securities to inland depositories. The Spanish Armada eventually wheezed into bottle-shaped Santiago Harbor, Cuba, where it was easily blockaded by the most powerful American fleet. Sound strategy seemed to dictate that an American army be sent in from the rear to drive out the Spanish ships. Leading the invading force was a grossly overweight General William R. Shafter, a would-be warrior so blubbery and gout-stricken that he had to be carried about on a door. His troops were woefully unequipped for war in the tropics. They had been amply provided with heavy woolen underwear and uniforms designed for sub-zero operations against the Indians. The Rough Riders, a part of the invading army, now charged onto the stage of history. This colorful regiment of volunteers, short on discipline but large on dash, consisted largely of Western cowboys and other hardy characters, with a sprinkling of ex-polo players and ex-convicts. Commanded by Colonel Leonard Wood, the group was organized principally by the glory-chasing Theodore Roosevelt, who had resigned from the Navy Department to serve as lieutenant colonel. He was so nearsighted that as a safeguard he took along a dozen pair of spectacles, cached in hardy spots on his person or nearby. About the middle of June, a bewildered American army of 17,000 men finally embarked at congested Tampa, Florida, amid scenes of indescribable confusion. Shafter's landing near Santiago, thanks to diversionary tactics of Cuban insurrectos, met little opposition. Brisk fighting broke out on July 1st at El Caney and Kettle Hill, up which Colonel Roosevelt and his horseless Rough Riders charged, with strong support from 2 crack black regiments. They suffered heavy casualties, but the They suffered heavy casualties, but the colorful colonel, having the time of his life, shot a Spaniard with his revolver and rejoiced to see his victim double up like a jackrabbit. He later wrote a book on his exploits, which the famous satirist Finley Peter Dunn's character, Mr. Dooley, remarked ought to have been entitled Alone in Cubia, Sick. The American army, fast closing in on Santiago, spelled doom for the badly outgunned Spanish fleet. On July 3rd, the Spaniards dutifully steamed out of the harbor and into the teeth of the waiting American warships. "Don't cheer, men," Captain Philip of the Texas admonished his seamen. "The poor devils are dying." Thereafter, Santiago surrendered. Hasty preparations were now made for a descent upon Puerto Rico before the war should end. There, the American army met even less resistance than in Cuba. By this time, Spain had satisfied its honor. On August 12, 1898, it signed an armistice. If the Spaniards had held out for a few months longer in Cuba, the American army might have melted away. The inroads of malaria, typhoid fever, dysentery, and yellow fever became so severe that hundreds were incapacitated, an army of convalescents. Others suffered from malodorous canned meat known as embalmed beef. All told, nearly 400 men lost their lives with bullets. Over 4,000 succumbed to bacteria and other causes. America's course, curse of empire. Late in 1898, Spanish and American negotiators met in Paris. War-racked Cuba, as expected, was freed from its Spanish overlords. The Americans had little difficulty in securing the remote Pacific island of Guam, which they had captured early into the conflict from the astonished Spaniards who, lacking a cable, had not known that a war was on. Spanish also ceded Puerto Rico to the United States as payment for war costs. Ironically, the last remnant of Spain's vast New World empire thus became the first territory ever annexed to the United States without the express promise of eventual statehood. In decades to come, American investment in the island and Puerto Rican immigration to the United States would make this acquisition one of the weightier consequences of the somewhat carefree war. Naughtiest of all was the problem of the Philippines, a veritable apple of discord. These lush islands not only embraced an area larger than the British Isles, but also contained an ethnically diverse population of some 7 million souls. McKinley was confronted with a devil's dilemma. He did not feel that America could honorably give the islands back to the Spanish misrule, especially after it fought a war to free Cuba, and America would be turning its back upon its responsibilities in a cowardly fashion, he believed, if he simply pulled up anchor and sailed away. McKinley viewed virtually all the choices open to him as trouble-fraught. The Filipinos, if left to govern themselves, might fall into anarchy. One of the major powers, possibly aggressive Germany or Japan, might try to seize them. The result would be a major war into which the United States would be sucked. Seemingly the least of all evils consistent with national honor and safety was to acquire all the Philippines and then perhaps give the Filipinos their freedom later. President McKinley, ever sensitive to public opinion, kept a careful ear attuned to the ground. The rumble that he heard seemed to call for the entire group of islands. Zealous Protestant missionaries were eager for new converts from Spanish Catholicism, and the invalid Mrs. McKinley, to whom her husband was devoted, expressed deep concern about the welfare of the Filipinos. Wall Street had generally opposed the war, but awakened by the booming of Dewey's guns, it was a clamoring for profits in the Philippines. The tormented McKinley later claims that he went down on his knees seeking divine guidance, and heard an inner voice telling him to take all the Philippines and Christianize and civilize them. Accordingly, he decided for an outright annexation of the islands. Manila remained a sticking point with the Spaniards because it had been captured the day after the armistice was signed, and the city could not therefore be properly claimed among the spoils of war. But the Americans broke the deadlock by agreeing to pay Spain $20 million for the Philippine Islands, the last great Spanish haul from the New World. Signing of the Pact of Paris touched off one of the most impassioned foreign policy debates in American history. The issue of what to do with the Philippines confronted Americans with the fundamental questions about their national identity. Except for glacial Alaska, coral reefed Hawaii, and a handful of Pacific atolls acquired mostly for whaling stations and guano fertilizer needed to replenish southern soil exhausted by overcultivation, the Republic had hitherto absorbed only contiguous territory on the continent. All previous accessions had been thinly peopled and eligible for ultimate statehood. But in the Philippines, the nation had on its hands a distant tropical area, thickly populated by Asians of a different culture, tongue, and government institutions. Opponents of annexation argued that such a step would dishonor and ultimately destroy America's venerable commitments to self-determination and anti-colonialism. "God damn the United States for its vile conduct in the Philippine Islands," burst out the usually well-mannered Professor William James. The Harvard philosopher could not believe the United States would puke up its ancient soul in 5 minutes without a wink of squeamishness. Speaker of the House, Czar Reed, resigned in protest against America's new imperial adventure. Proponents countered that the Philippine annexation would promote a glorious history of expansion and that pushed American civilization to the Pacific and now beyond. If Americans were morally bound to abandon the Philippines under Theodore Roosevelt, we are also morally bound to abandon Arizona to the Apaches. The Anti-Imperialist League sprang into being to fight the McKinley administration's expansionist moves. The organization counted among its members some of the most prominent people in the United States, including the president of Stanford and Harvard universities, and the novelist Mark Twain. The anti-imperialist blanket even stretched over such strange bedfellows as the labor leader Samuel Gompers and the steel titan Andrew Carnegie. Anti-imperialists raised many objections. The Filipinos thirsted for freedom, and to annex them would violate the consent of the governing philosophy in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Despotism abroad might well beget despotism at home. Imperialism was costly and unlikely ever to turn a profit. Finally, annexation would propel the United States into the political and military cauldron of East Asia. Yet the expansionists or imperialists could sing a seductive song. They appealed to patriotism, invoked America's civilizing mission, and played up possible trade profits. Manila, they claimed, might become another Hong Kong. Rudyard Kipling, the British poet laureate of imperialism, urged America down the slippery path with a quotable poem that he circulated before publication to Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge. Roosevelt found it good sense, but poor poetry. "Take up the white man's burden. Ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness." In short, the wealthy Americans must help to uplift and exploit the underprivileged, underfed, and underclad of the world. Over heated protests, the Senate approved the treaty with Spain with just one vote to spare on February 6, 1899. America was now officially an empire.